We're all good. I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's speaker. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. André Brock for the final lecture in our calendar year inaugural Public Interest Technology University Network, that's the PIT-UN series, which is co-sponsored by AFOG, the D-Lab, and Cal Nerds at UC Berkeley. Dr. Brock is an associate professor in the Department of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. Dr. Brock's the author of the widely renowned Distributed Blackness, African-American Cybercultures, a landmark book bridging science and technology studies, communication, and digital studies. Oh, it truly is. Dr. Brock's extensive list of publications includes work on critical technological discourse analysis, Black Twitter, the Blackbird web browser, racial representation in Resident Evil, and Afrofuturism, among other subjects. Dr. Brock has received a range of accolades in research and teaching. He's worked as a visiting fellow with Microsoft Research, and most recently, keynoted the Association of Internet Researchers 2021 conference. Today's talk, which is titled On Race and Technoculture, promises to be a fantastic way to round out our calendar year programming for AFOG, PIT-UN, and the Fiat Justice Scholars Program. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Brock, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Happy post-Thanksgiving, end of semester, beginning of Christmas break to all of you. Hopefully your weather is as nice as mine is. It is 61 degrees here in Atlanta. Today I want to talk to you about race and technoculture, and I'll share my slide in a minute. But to preface that, let me offer some guides for how André talks. So I talk really fast. I do a lot of theory, and I don't tell good stories. So you have kind of been warned. Also, at this point, thanks to the pandemic, I have managed to give a fair number of talks that have been posted to the web. So you may have seen pieces of this talk here and there, but I promise that I tried to bring y'all something different based on what you guys invited me to talk about. So hopefully that will gel. Oh, the last piece is this presentation ain't done. Right, so I'll stop after a certain point where I think I can safely conclude, and then open up the floor for questions to try to entertain some thoughts about what I said, but also what you guys are thinking. So hopefully that helps. And let's go ahead and get started. I will share my slide. Can everybody see my slides? Affirmative. Let's let Deirdre say, yes, I saw his slide. We'll be good. Okay. Okay. So when asked to provide a title for this talk, I choose. I give a lot of talks. And I have decided to start putting them under a blanket title on race and technoculture while tailoring them for specific audiences, in part to kind of absolve me of some of the labor of continuing to provide original talks for every time I'm asked to talk, but also because there are elements of the book that I wish to revisit as I have now celebrating a year and change of having produced it. So today I want to talk to you about something which I hope is in line with what I understand the goals of this group is. And I want to talk about governmentality, specifically Black digital governmentality. And I see this as a part of my discussions of race and technology. And so algorithmic governments, as I understand it, is often positioned as a positive, technical, yet coercive mediation of civil behavior. Right? But the Western definition of civil carries connotations of propriety, humanity, and belonging. And these are all qualities that in the West are denied to Black folk. And you know, Du Bois has this canonical statement of double consciousness where he says that Black folk must constantly navigate two worlds. A communitarian sphere where they know that they are human and agents and subjects of knowledge, all the while having to navigate a categorical context, a space that constantly seeks to place them into certain categories and boxes in order to control them, where they are still perceived as technical objects and deviant bodies, never human. So when I talk about algorithmic governance or just online governance for Black communities, I feel like conversations in the Black community around civil discourses differ sharply from those described by mainstream outlets or by computer scientists' visualizations of how civil discourse should happen in online communities. And I say this to say, this is not your mama's public sphere. So I don't know if you recognize the two women on the slide. One of them is Belcalis Almanzar in the red, and the other one is Monica Mirage. They are also known as extremely famous and talented rappers. One is Cardi B, the other is Nicki Minaj. And I chose these two to begin talking about how the digital works to govern Blackness, Black communities, and Black ideologies. And if I were to follow the trailblazing path set by Sophia Noble and Ruha Benjamin, I could talk about the carceral practices of poorly coded content moderation algorithms, where impassioned, often crude rejoinders to racists by Black women and activists seeking to defend themselves are taken down by the algorithm without human participation, even as the offenders inciting comments and accounts are left to stand. But I do things differently. I say that racism does not overturn who I am and how I stand in the world. So I instead choose to focus on how Black people vivify themselves, how they exert themselves in a world where racism exists, but it's not the only thing they have to deal with. So my focus is on the mundane and Black digital practice. One of the qualities I talk about around Black digital practice is kind of inside baseball, right? I talk about Black respectability as a dogmatic digital practice, right? And respectability is not limited to the Black community. Many immigrant communities also navigate the concept of respectability, where the assimilation to the mainstream society often warps, if not outright destroys, longstanding historical and cultural traditions of the immigrant community. Black folk don't necessarily have those same resources to draw upon, since when we were brought here, civil, political, judicial, and carceral efforts were made to strip us of our language and our customs. And some things have survived, many more have not. But Black respectability has, and I talk about it as a dogmatic digital practice, right? Let me try to make that clear. So Black respectability politics itself is the quest for a warrant granting the Black community authority to speak to the public sphere. And by that, I mean that in shaping Black bodies and Black cultural practices in ways that are amenable to modernity and capitalism, Black respectability components like churches, like educational institutions, like politicians sought to make Black people legible to overarching authorities and institutions so that they could participate in those same institutions. Not often with great success. So while Brown v. Board is a canonical example of using the structures of white modernity, and American jurisprudence to try to get educational standards equitable for Black students, but what ended up happening, as Derek Bell and others have noted, is that what you did instead was take Black children out of schools where Black people who loved them taught them, and you put them in schools where white people thought of them as subhuman or deviant or ignorant. Right, we're instead charged with taking care of children and helping to form themselves and their identity. Not necessarily the best outcome for anybody. So while respectability is easily understood as a discursive endeavor, speaking the Black body into a rapprochement with white American racial ideology, my argument today is intended to highlight one possible online mediation of an aspect of Black identity, and that is online government. And in this, I'm mindful of Mitchell Dean's concern for the techne and episteme of government, right? Where he argues that we should understand in the concept of governmentality, how one could ask how specific ways of acting and intervening consist of particular types of practical rationality, relying upon techniques and technologies, as well as certain forms of thought and expertise. So I have Cardi B.
Dr. Brock, real quick, sorry.
Yes.
Yes. It's a little hard to hear you at the moment. Do you think you could maybe just even lean forward a little or something?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay. And so I have Cardi B and Nicki Minaj on the screen because while they represent at this point standards of Black beauty, they are also practitioners of an art form which still has yet to really achieve critical acclaim, even as it achieved mainstream popularity, and I would argue global dominance. Many popular musical forms have taken on aspects of hip hop in order to become globally popular. I'm thinking particularly of K-pop, right? But at the same time, these women are also subject to discussions within the Black community on how they comport themselves in public, how their comportment speaks poorly of Black people, right? and how their performance in their particular their status as performers of a particular art form also leads them to be understood as deviant and immoral, right? They're both frequently talk about their own sex acts and how much they enjoy them. And these are still perceived as acts in which Black women should not be so openly celebratory and performative. And I should say, these pictures were taken from a 2018 moment where they were both at New York Fashion Week and they got into a scuffle. And Cardi B threw a shoe at Nicki Minaj, but somehow ended up with a bump on her own forehead. So this picture is the aftermath of that scuffle. And it engendered a pretty vigorous online discussion, right? And in the process, highlighted some aspects of Black governmentality that happened in the digital sphere. So they went from personal animus between the two rappers and their fan communities to respectability tropes such as deportment, Black kairos, the disposition of women's bodies, racial capitalism, and rap as an inappropriate artistic genre. So it really got loud in here. I apologize if that makes it difficult to hear. However, as I was trying to figure out how to explain Cardi B and Nicki Minaj, something else came up while I was crafting this presentation originally. A huge argument, again with hip hop at its core, but that more specifically speaks to what online spaces can do in the process of governance by the community of the community, as opposed to algorithmic governance. And this arose on Black Twitter over the National Museum of African American History. Let's do that. I don't know if I can get to that. Hopefully the sound is a little bit better and you can see my slides. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you. I'm so sorry for the difficulties. Blame the carpet cleaners.
Oh, you're good.
So an argument arose on Black Twitter, again in 2018, over the National Museum of African American History, more popularly known in the Black community as the Blacksonian, right? A white woman staff member, and the significance of hip hop to Blackness and Black culture. The commentary quickly devolved into accusations of coercion and bullying, but from a very different group of Twitter users than you would expect. There are tweets, threads, invectives, think pieces, and apologies that emerge from the Civil War, and I'll show some of them to you on the next slide. And so that data will be the empirical basis for the theories that I'm offering today. And so I have a quote from Ron Judy on the screen, and I argue that this is a different epistemological standpoint from which to understand both governance and the ways that algorithms can be used to govern. Right. And so from this quote, community here is defined as a group of moral beings grounded in values to transcend the domain of things, transforming these nigger things to the Negro subject. By policing itself, the Black community seeks to avoid dehumanization at the hands of the state, resulting from governmental and technical linkages between Blackness, deviance, and criminality. But in doing so, it must align with the agents and institutions of white racial ideology, underlying subjectivity in the American nation state. And Judy wrote this argument, this citation in 1994. So it's fair to assume that he wasn't thinking about the digital, right? And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about how Black Twitter's digital practices, particularly around respectability politics, can be understood as governmentality with the aim of recasting possibilities for algorithmic governance. So this tweet in the upper right is the one that started the Civil War, drawing out Black academics, which are not the same by any standard, right? Influencers, Blacktivists, and regular Black Twitter users. The tweet says, there is a white woman curating the hip hop art part of the NMAHC, Smithsonian. Who let this shit happen? Right? And this tweet is incendiary, I argue, although many other people jumped in to say he's just asking a question. And let me offer a technical explanation of why I say it's incendiary, because I am very familiar with the idea that when you type in all caps in any computer mediated discourse form, it is understood as shouting. So, and shouting is technically not a way to conduct civil discourse. So the fact that he typed in all caps with extra exclamation points meant that he intended to start a vociferous discussion, even though the user later on said he was just asking a question. I don't understand why y'all reacted so strongly to it. It's just a random question. Why y'all being so vexed about it, right? But this started the war. Right? The white woman in question is Timothy Ann. I can't remember her last name. I'm a terrible academic, right? And she was selected as a curator of the hip hop at the Smithsonian, in part because she has a professional resume and expertise in curating hip hop archives, not necessarily as an artist, but as an academician, right? As a docent, I think they're called in museum law, right? And when this man found out that this white woman was doing this caused this entire cultural argument, right? So because of the way he framed the question, people responded in kind. So the tweet in the lower right describes how people who have never been to the museum, had no plans to go, have never donated, and have no knowledge about who works there, and most likely have less knowledge about hip hop than the lady they picked, suddenly pretend to care about who curates an exhibit. And another one in counterpoint to that, right, on the lower left-hand corner, is funny how some verified Black women are not standing for the Black women in the race, right? They're not supporting other Black women, but are for a white woman who has no history of doing anything for us, who was a Republican, who was okay for what they stood for, and who is using a charm offensive to attract them. Right. So these are relatively sophisticated arguments. This is not simply calling people out their name. They're not using profanity. They're not doing things that would normally trigger an algorithm to moderate these conversations to get a more civil level. In fact, I would argue this type of discourse would be encouraged in many bulletin boards and forums that predate Twitter, because this signifies engagement. And indeed, this conversation generated hundreds of thousands of tweets. Right. What I argue, though, is that these tweets can be understood as an articulation both of Black respectability and social media's affordances to push back and govern Black respectability. So there are valid points made, but what truly emerged through the context of these threads and tweets is a 21st century perspective on Black archives, Black culture, and access to those. Now, when I talk about Black respectability, specifically in the context of the online, I'm talking about Black online discourses promoting a specific set of moral virtues enacted in and around digital practice. So even though it may seem banal to say, and they wrote this on Twitter, Twitter in fact provides the mediation through which this argumentation can take place. So these practices take place in digital spaces and across other social media platforms, couched in terms of uplift or resistance, but more frequently debating relationships between Black agency and our relationship to white culture and the American nation state. Black respectability adherents, as seen in the tweet on the bottom right, pathologize ratchet activity and unproductive offline and digital behavior with the goal of getting Black folk to assimilate to perceived white Western technocultural norms and aesthetics. And I argue in Distributed Blackness that dogmatic digital practice, right, this hope that if we follow these beliefs, we'll be accepted, right, it powers online Black respectability. Social media does a lot to alienate respectability's potential for social change, right? And it does so for Twitter specifically, an interactivity and a flat hierarchy of discussion that allows counter discourses to disempower technical and technological respectability. So I mentioned Ronald Judy before. This is yet another quote from him. There'll probably be one more at least because I love it, right? And this is his essay on nigger authenticity. And he offers the following claim: the nigger becomes the Negro through moral behavior or good works, founded on morality as a governmental habit of thought, police and law as internalized control. And again, transposing this forward to digital practice, there are ways in which Twitter etiquette, but also algorithmic standards of moderation also form a governmental habit of thought to justify and promote, or shadow ban, which has become a popular term, these types of discussions. And I feel they're all part and parcel of the same thing, right? And so Judy's arguments on authenticity and Blackness serve as a powerful refutation of respectability politics, even as he recognizes that Black authority figures, or blue checks, right, by definition, must contravene white standards of propriety in order to morally lead their community. From this perspective, Black respectability politics is the performance of a specific version of Black culture for two audiences: Blacks who should be respectable and whites who needed to be shown that Blacks could be respectable. Right? Kathy Cohen argues that respectability politics polices, sanitizes, and hides nonconformist behaviors, of which we could certainly say hip hop is an avatar, right, of certain members of African American communities and individuals. But even in doing so, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham argues that it assumes a fluid and shifting position along a continuum of African American. How did I get here, right? How do I take the instrumental nature of the Twitter interface plus the discourse mechanisms that shape the interactions between the users, the service, the organization, and the wider world to come to this point where I can talk about Black respectability? And I got there through libidinal economy. I came to libidinal economy because I needed to empiricize affect. And that's too good, right? So I have pretensions of being a social scientist, and I'm still a rhetorician. And I talk about technology as a three-part construct. I say technology has three pieces. They are the artifact itself, whether that's hardware, software, or content. There are practices, right? So the production of that content by users, or the design of that artifact by designers, or the Apple marketing program that uses Cardi B as a spokesperson for a particular product, or the Congress trying to adjudicate social media expression for good or for ill by letting far-right figures say whatever they want in the guise of individual free speech, right? That is the artifact and the practices. And those are typically the only two ways through which we understand technologies. I often ask my students, however, what type of phone they use. This might work for y'all as well. Do you use an Apple phone or do you use an Android phone? And when people say they use Android phones, I say, well, what type of phone user is an Apple user, right? And all of a sudden, we go from the technical capacities of the Apple phone, Face ID, the size and shape, the material used in its design, the interface. All of a sudden, we go to beliefs about what those type of people are. So, I mean, of course, I'm sitting in a Starbucks. So people who sit in Starbucks with the laptop, doing nothing all day, or people who are technically unsophisticated, only purchase Apple phones because it's a fad, or people who value convenience over actual computing power. All these beliefs are constitutive of what technologies are and do. And so, because I try to be empirical, or at least empirical in perception, right? I needed to operationalize how that belief becomes part of technical design, dissemination, and use. For that, I turn to libidinal economy. But my path is crooked. So the libidinal is equated with athlete. I often get called out because I'm not about to reference Lucy Guattari or even Young. Instead, I turn to Francois Lyotard, right? But before I got to Lyotard, I was reading Frank Wilderson, Jared Sexton, and Fred Moten, the Afro-pessimists. And they said that the libidinal economy describes why some things cannot be exchanged, even as we are inundated with political economic rationales that everything has an exchange value. But what's the exchange value of love? Is Valentine an appropriate commodified expression of love? Or from a more technical perspective, does Facebook's use of the word friends and the mechanics that it has erected in order for us to recognize that we have an affiliation with other people, does that necessarily satisfy the enormously varied connotations that we assign to friendships? How do you understand close friends on Facebook? How do you understand your family? I got in trouble once because when my mother joined Facebook, she asked me to become her friend. And I told her, you told me you're not my little friend, so we shouldn't be friends on Facebook. That didn't go over. Right? So there's a libidinal economic capacity to even the most rational of political economic decisions, right? Wilderson does enormous work for me because he talks about anti-Blackness, which helps me to cement exactly what a libidinal impulse, a libidinal tension could be, right? And they say that anti-Blackness is the libidinal tension powering American arts and culture, right? Where Blackness is denied the capacity to be human, that Blacks are in a non-communicable position with the rest of Western society, not even able to be alienated because alienation requires humanity. Instead, we are technical objects. And so while I appreciate their use of libidinal economy to define and explain anti-Blackness, I'm not an Afro-pessimist, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. To continue a little bit more about libidinal economy, in part because I find I introduced more confusion than I probably anticipated. Libidinal economy is more visceral than I would argue affect is, right? And it's key to keep those two words linked together, right? So the libidinal, the deviant, the erotic, and the affective undergirds political economies, powering them through the realization of inchoate or even explicit desires, pleasures, pains, and hatreds. Right? So anti-Blackness, as I said, from Wilderson, is the libidinal economy powering, libidinal energy powering American culture, arts, and politics. But anti-Blackness as a concept also helps to clarify Du Bois' formulation of double consciousness in order to, by illuminating the discursive coercion that Black folk undergo in order to fit into American culture. So I employ libidinal economy as a systematic inquiry into the tensions that power information technologies and digital practices. Not because I want to say that they're anti-Black, right? But instead, I want to make apparent the deeper influences of cultural belief on supposedly rational and efficient technical processes and practices. For my research, the primary benefit of incorporating libidinal economy into analyses of information technology is the illumination of how racial ideology powers digital practice. So for example, Lisa Nakamura talks about online civility, incivility, or in her essay, Glitch Racism, while Kishana Gray talks about griefing, the practice of deliberately making other players' experiences in a game service unpleasant, right? That's Kishana Gray's work, as pleasurable, white masculinist, misogynist, and patriarchal digital practices, even though they are nominally considered to be deviant. Right? Even though they're deviant, they are long-standing, ongoing, even valorized practices of interaction on these platforms, including trolling and griefing on social media, right? And in digital gaming. So online discussion about Nicki Minaj could be understood as computer-mediated communication. Or it could be understood from a media studies perspective as conflagration between two very engaged fan communities. But I argue that it also can be understood as a discussion of Kairos, desire, femininity, humanity, and modernity. That last is particularly important. So modernity, I argue for as one of the bases of what our technoculture is today. Specifically focusing for me on the digital. And I argue that the digital is elastic because it can simulate entire worlds by creating virtual spaces for human sociality. Elasticity can also be illustrated by the concept that while WordPress has the same 30 or so free themes, each theme instance on a website will be configured in ways that are pleasurable or make meaning for the user. This elasticity further affords belief. So technology should be understood as made up of practices and beliefs. Some of those same beliefs power technology in general, but also some are specific to the digital. I'll talk about those in a second. This elasticity, however, is denied to non-whites. Black and indigenous folk are fixed as primitive, while South Asian and East Asian folk are fixed as spiritual. One of the changes that has happened in this mode of belief over the last few years is that suddenly the extraction of data from people who are white, middle class, and heterosexual is now seen as just as pernicious to those white folk as it was when it was practiced on Black people, right? And so now you get enormous funding being devoted to researchers who are interested in looking at disinformation and misinformation. But the United States has always engaged in disinformation and misinformation. It was just against either foreign entities or Black and brown elements within its own borders. Now, suddenly, since it's being applied to and putting in danger the American telos of democracy, now suddenly we need to devote resources to understanding why those particular forms of communication can be dangerous to quote unquote everybody. Going back to libidinal economy and the digital is also religious, operating as a near worship of the spiritual power of data as knowledge and its all-seeing capacity for simulation as a balm or a mapping of social structures and ills. Rather than putting faith in the works of a supreme being, religion recenters technology as a source of ineffable blessings and ills, either a digital utopia where speech is free and democratic, right? Or a hellscape of incivility, terroristic acts, and violations of the informational self. Religion, as a belief about the digital, also is a grounding for its links to transcendence, where the body is rendered in ones and zeros while eschewing the bounds of material existence. You know, like Facebook suddenly deciding that the best path forward for its conservatorship of 1.2 billion bodies is to move us all to a metaverse where we are recreated as digital avatars and construct and build sociality with one another there, as opposed to the real world problems that Facebook has engendered in Myanmar and in the United States and UK around Brexit and the QAnon and the Tea Party. Facebook would rather turn its attention towards building new frontiers from which to exploit bodies. The future can be understood as whiteness and the West's quest for omniscience, where information control over bodies, surveillance, and the material world, algorithms, networks, and datification is directly linked to spiritual, economic, and political gain. Also, information technologies are always seen as futuristic, drawing as they do on beliefs about control of the spirit and the abstract reason of mathematics. Finally, progress is closely tied to the future as it is measured by the increase on, reliance on, and deployment of computational solutions to social problems. There's one other quality that I want to bring up as well, though, and it specifically applies to the content moderation that I've been discussing in bits and pieces as I've been talking, and that the internet has long been argued for as a democratic space, a public sphere invigorated by network interactivity, allowing folk who previously had little or no political power to suddenly be a part of conversations about how the world should be controlled and disposed of. But this belief in the democratic capacities of the internet is a shell game. The US origination of the web depended on military networks of communication and control. While in its most recent incarnation, it's become very clear that the web is becoming once again a closed garden. Closed garden, controlled by carriers, ISPs, platforms, and FANG, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. Neither the original version or the one we have today is democratic, where democracy is governance of the people by the people. So in order to understand the democratic possibilities of the web without calling it democracy, I've adopted Graham Turner's term demotic, or of the people. And I use this because while algorithms attract deserved attention for their governance of platforms and services, it is the energies and actions of everyday folk that can provide insights into shaping how communities should be moderated and governed so that we can all get along. Thanks to writing. So I've been name checking modernity here and there. And I want to return to that because I feel like content moderation is in many ways shaped upon principles of how whiteness sees itself in control of the world and people inside of it. So modernity itself can be understood as an insistence that ontology, axiology, and aesthetics belong to distinct knowledge domains. Position privileging whiteness Cartesian/Christian attestation of the separation of mind and body, or current trends of mindfulness and self-care that are somehow separate from universal healthcare and insurance. For example, where modernity and capitalism insist that work is emancipatory and provides agency, Black folk have long understood that work only signifies servitude, misery, and subordination. And I'm referring to industrial modernity here, the command of space and time through network communication, which in the process reworks relationships between the self, commerce, institutions, discourses, and technology. Modernity is thus tied deeply to progress and the future, further cementing the role of technology as a spirit of the West. And through modernity, trust and risk have supplanted belief and faith. Modernity depends upon the valorization of rationality, the scientific method, and logic as the most appropriate avenues to understand the world and our place in it, all the while centering whiteness as the group best equipped to deploy it. Why am I here? So I argue that modernity does so much to reinforce the interpretive flexibility of whiteness. And interpretive flexibility here denotes the capacity to be simultaneously understood as individual and everyone. So I use a terrible example of WordPress. The multiple themes are available for free and the ways in which you can personalize and individuate them. But let me also offer another example of your web browser. Every operating system comes installed with the web browser. Depending on your operating system, that will be Safari for Apple, that will be Microsoft Edge for Windows systems, or for Android phones, it will be the Chrome browser. And they're placed on every desktop screen and operating system menu. But even as they, and in doing so, they harbor an infinite variety of web content, presaging the idea that you have universal access to a cornucopia of information. However, once you use someone else's browser, you immediately become aware that every person's orientation to their browser, to their phone, to that information is individual, right? There may be group trends that are understood, that can be understood through cultural commonplaces, but every person's browser is different. Hell, every person's desktop is different. I just recently saw a picture online of a woman who had so many files on her desktop, it looked like the solitaire windscreen from Windows. I know y'all play solitaire where the cars just started bouncing around and filling the screen with white rectangles. That's what her desktop looked like, right? Many of you may be shuddering at this point. I know I was, because I know that keeping your desktop clean allows your computer to run faster, but many more people see the desktop as a place just to deposit files that you might have used or going to use again, or it's a default download destination. But my point here is that even though we all have the same operating system, in many cases the same hardware configuration with a desktop metaphor, we still bring our individual preference to shape that space. Similarly, today's smartphones also represent universality and individuation, right? Because of their interpretive flexibility. The entire screen, when you select an app, fills to focus on that one app and one app only, despite an operating system that offers instant access to all other apps as well as the entire internet. This interpretive flexibility also translates to the decentralized nature of the early internet, coupled with light moderation of topics of interest on early bulletin boards and bulletin board services and forums that populated the internet from, I'd argue, what was then the internet, although largely it was PDP clusters at universities, but later CompuServe, AOL, and then Java Chat, right? Light moderation of topics of interest rather than a cultural import, right? So we're decentralized because that was the architecture of the internet. It is modern because it transcends space and time, but it's also predisposed towards topics which are rational. They're topics of interest, right? And I argue that this set of affordances allowed movements like Gamergate and QAnon space and energy to grow, if not metastasize. And I say this because the interpretive flexibility of beliefs about individual liberty as preeminent democratic values also fostered these illiberal discourse communities, and later modifications or improvements such as Facebook moved to make Facebook groups private, right, allowed smaller groups to become entire networks of discursive, political, and physical violence. Even still, anti-Blackness becomes visible where the FBI steps in to say that Black and Muslim activist organizations with online presences are terroristic, instead of focusing on the Oath Keepers or other white supremacist groups using Facebook, Gab, Parler, to a lesser extent, Twitter, Reddit, but also Facebook groups, right? To promote things such as the insurrection on January 6th, right? And this demonstrates to me the fact that whiteness reserves the power of modernity, the structuring of networks and discourse practices for itself. So I should return as I start to wind this down because I've gone far afield. I should return to a little bit about the Black discourse communities I was interested in talking about. So I mentioned earlier, much earlier in this presentation, uh, the that there was an entire conversation around a white woman curating hip hop at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History. And one of the things that compelled me to think through this particular conversation as a discussion of Black governance is, again, returning to Judy, this conversation, this quote that I have on screen, that it is an error to think that being Negro existentially, being a Black human, results from a particular set of morally determined social decisions and acts. And so I chose in Distributed Blackness to kind of follow this maxim that Blackness is not something that a Black body automatically inherits. There's a mode of intentionality and participation in the communal structure, right? That goes above and beyond the political economy of racism, but also of technoculture and modernity, right? And that while there are moral decisions being made, instead, there are also libidinal tensions between anti-Blackness, capitalism, modernity, and necropolitics. So let me illustrate. Did I do it again? I did it again. All right, let me continue this bit before I go on. It's the worst presentation. I apologize. Anyway, so respectability politics seeks to modify embodied, sensual, and deviant Blackness to our standards of middle-class white behavior, rendering it casually, curiously racist in both its depictions of Black female deviance and in its valorization of whiteness for political gain. In recent years, social media and online spaces have become a fertile ground for respectability adherence, a space where images of inappropriate Black behavior or representation can be recuperated with pithy admonitions in tweets or in comments to act right or to do better. An analytics of governmentality, examining these respectability adherents online, reveals ostensibly rational goals executed through deliberate and systematic forms of digital practice, expertise, Black thought, and knowledge. And historically, Black respectability proponents sought to transform and reorient Black bodies away from older folkways or what they perceived as excessive behaviors and reorient them towards modernity and rationality, with the goal of gaining access to the franchise, to become property owners instead of property, to avoid social death, and to gain the ability to be heard in the American public sphere. What the tweets I'm about to show you, however, help me to exemplify a libidinal economic analysis of respectability, one which unpacks emotional impulses powering both the machinations of these political economic structures, but also a pushback on these same structures. And I find this approach can be understood as governmentality because I try to investigate the practices that try to shape, sculpt, mobilize, and work through the choices, desires, aspirations, needs, wants, and lifestyles of individuals and groups. It's worth considering that the libidinal energy powering respectability politics comes from denial. Denial of prevailing stereotypes of Black culture, that we are a low-class, undifferentiated mass, that the art forms in which we create, participate, and perform are somehow not worthy of the same acclaim as more classical forms of literature, of music, or of art, right? And a denial of the libidinal energies of Black folk culture, even while we're aware of the consequences of doing this type of denial and assimilation. And so from this perspective, what happens when respectability is performed in digital media? So there's a phrase, which some of you may be familiar with and some are not. It is the Black blue check. The blue check is Twitter's terribly flawed implementation of a standard from which to say that a particular user has import to the service, that they are somehow an authority in whatever sphere they operate in. And as such, they are rewarded with this little symbol next to the name of, next to the display name of the user, right? And I can say, because I recently ended up getting a blue check through no fault of my own, that it also offers additional ways of mediating and moderating your presence on Twitter, where you can see conversations between yourself and other blue checks. You can also have access to certain features of Twitter, such as moderation practices, in addition to the block list that people have begun to use, but also early access to the subscription services now called Twitter. Right, so it is performing the selection of elites through technical practice. For Black people, when elites are recognized by modern or white institutions, that immediately becomes a problem, right? Because for Black culture in the Americas, people who are recognized by the right institutions, whether it's education, politics, or the like, are somehow assumed to be complicit in the domination and coercion of Black people, both against their will and against the aims of the community, right? So getting a blue check, which ostensibly should be, not necessarily a bad thing, means the service finds you of interest, right, has also accumulated a fair amount of invective from people who don't have this particular verification mark on their things. And so we get called Black blue checks. We get called bourgeois. There's a magazine, a website that's become immensely popular among Black people. It's called Blavity. I'm assuming it means Black activity, but who knows what's going on here, right? And it promotes a certain Black bourgeois lifestyle. Some of you may have heard the term, this is related, I swear, may have heard the term trap yoga or trap brunch, right? And one of the arguments about this particular phrasing, the use of the word trap as an adjective to describe an activity that bourgeois people participate in, such as yoga or brunch, right, is meant to be derogatory by the people who don't like bourgeois, right? Because it marks the fact that these people who have achieved this bourgeois status are somehow attempting to reconnect with the folk through their use of a deviant connotation of the word, the deviant connotation that's associated with the word trap. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Black slang, the trap is basically the space where young Black men go to sell drugs and use drugs, right? So think about it, right? Here's a phrase which describes a bourgeois activity such as brunch, right? Links it to the deviant activity of doing criminal behavior, right? And is deployed as a way for Black professionals and middle class and upper class folk to somehow gain some sort of reconnection with their roots, right? And the everyday folk on Twitter see through that immediately, saw through that. Right? And so if you have a Black blue check, you're immediately associated with the bourgeois, and you'll gain a certain amount of ridicule. So returning to this particular technical implementation, I can add that this blue check signifies the performance of Black culture for two audiences: Black bourgeoisie desiring to be modern, and whites who needed to be shown that Blacks can be respected. It emphasizes that these folk have assimilated to and reformed their individual behaviors and attitudes as a goal in and of itself, and as a strategy for reform of the structural system of the institution they participate in, and the entire structural system of American race relations. And it includes, but is not limited to, dress codes, expressive culture, music, speech patterns, public etiquette, and digital practice. It's a failure to conform to these politics and respectability is equated with deviance, ignorance, or pathology. This failure could be correlated, and often is, as a rationale for racism against Black folk by white people, racist terrorism, and institutional discrimination. So these Black respectability politics police, sanitize, and hide nonconformist behaviors of certain members of African American communities, but in doing so, that again assumes this fluid and shifting position along the continuum of African American resistance. So, social media then, particularly Twitter, right, does a lot to abrogate, to diminish the power of respectability. So while there have been multiple memes, tweets, and screeds posted to Twitter and other digital media platforms, exhorting young Black men to pull their pants up, or telling young Black women to dress more modestly, so that, or women in general, but young Black women in particular, there was a hashtag called fast-tailed girls, right? Telling women if they dress more modestly and behaved in certain ways, that men would not harass them. Or more recently, if women would just carry a gun, that men would not follow them to their homes and attempt to kill them, right? Social media has done a lot, particularly Twitter, in illustrating ways that people can speak back to these dogmatic ways of understanding relationships between self, technology, and American society, right? By affording this two-way discussion. Twitter's flat hierarchy and discourse mechanisms of follower and followee allow Black people to speak back to the aims of responsibility community. So I have on the slide a conversation, a Twitter conversation, right? Because you don't often control who can speak back to you. They've recently introduced that functionality, but it's still not something new. So the African American celebrity, I use that in adult meaning, Aisha Curry, who many of you may not be familiar with, is a influencer, a chef, and a wife of a two-time NBA MVP, world champion basketball player named Wardell Stephen Curry, or Steph Curry. And she made the mistake a few years back of saying that everyone's into barely wearing clothes these days. Not my style. I keep the good stuff covered up for the one who matters. And because of her status as an influencer, at this point, she had nearly 1 million followers, plus another few 100,000 on Instagram. She had a television show where she cooked. She had sponsorships and endorsements from various companies, right? From this position, plus the fact that you can see the blue check by her name, she could be reasonably understood both as an authority, a technical authority, but also supposedly as a moral and cultural authority, right? But when she issued this statement, people pushed back on her immediately. So the young sister, Felicia Nista, I have her tweet below this, and she said, well, what's wrong with not being covered up? Are you saying that you're better than women who show off their figures? And this tweet was significant to me, enough so that I spent time talking about it in the book, right? Because again, it allows Black folk to speak back to cultural elites, to political elites, in ways that were previously circumscribed by previous media forms or institutional forms. So if a politician is speaking at a rally, you can bring a bullhorn, right? You may be heard using your bullhorn by talking over what that politician has to say, but there are very few instances where you can get to speak back to a politician as if you are equals, as if you can speak on the same topics with the same level of expertise, history, and authority. Right. Similarly, letters to the editors doesn't provide that capacity for speaking back to elites. Those letters are heavily curated, selected for the paper's liability, right? Not just to mention the reliability and performance of self as civil space for discourse. So those letters to the editor will not represent the most egregious forms. Many of you say. And so I argue that Twitter, in its own way, from the ground up, provides a space for governing a community by allowing folk to speak back to their supposed betters. And so where peccadillos and misdeeds were once only whispered about or discussed in local third places, such as the stoop, such as the barbershop, maybe the time after church, right? Social media and entertainment blogs encourage Black folk to comment publicly about the Black elites, using same affordances of memes and affinity networks. And through this two-way performative discourse, dogmatic digital practice, in its embrace of embodied propriety and neoliberal notions of digital practice, gets chastised by the everyday as being nearly indistinguishable from colorblind, racist, technocultural rhetorics. I'm gonna start to conclude here. What I would like to bring up, and hopefully this could become a topic for conclusion, is how then can we get content moderation networks, often powered by machine learning, which is a nebulous enough phrase if we could talk about it, right? And limited human moderation, often of people who are not the same cultural commonplaces as the people they're moderating. How can we get those algorithms to then understand that these conversations are a way of keeping a conversation engaged and civil using the cultural forms that the people engaged in are used to? Similarly, in a space that is designed to be modern and technical, a space where discussions are meant to be are understood as supposedly only being rational and objective, how then do you get conversations which are misogynist or racist or violent, right? How can people respond to them in kind without getting shut down by those same modern and technical content moderation practices, right? So those of you who are old enough to remember AOL chat or Java chat, remember that there were certain words you absolutely could not type. It's an early form of algorithm moderation. If you type it and the algorithm picks up that you type a curse word or something, it will either blank it out or it will say that word is not allowed to be used. We still have these same technical affordances, right? These, although it's proclaimed that they are algorithmic and therefore the computations and calculations that they use are somehow more sophisticated because they have tons of millions of pieces of data, billions of pieces of data to work from, they still commit the same mistakes that would have been done if you simply had white kids fresh out of the Midwest trying to understand what a black kid from Gary, Indiana, Philadelphia, or Houston, Texas is trying to say when they're arguing. In other words, they're culturally insensitive, epistemologically ignorant to the ways in which argumentation happens, right? Or to how that argumentation can be used to push back against acceptable white practices of misogyny and racism. So I'll stop there with apologies for the way this presentation, and hopefully we can get some great questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brock. This was a wonderful talk. So it's almost 1 p.m. And so that's the official here. I'm going to just change the view for everyone here real quick. So we're going to move. We have a separate session for the workshop that we'll have. This will be the conclusion of the first hour here of the public lecture. And so if you have any questions or anything that you'd like to follow up on, to anybody out in the audience, I'm just going to go ahead and put my email in the chat. You can feel free to drop me an email if you have any questions. This lecture has been recorded and will be uploaded eventually. And so, yeah, we will go ahead and move to the other room for the AFOG internal event. And then thank you all for being here. I just want to say very quickly, I did not get the chance to introduce Deirdre Mulligan and Neelafar. Hello, Neelafar, there you are, who are the PIs for the AFOG group here at UC Berkeley. And just real quick, I'm Jeremy Johnson. I'm the postdoc working with AFOG and Pitt UN and the Fiat Justice Scholars Program. Deirdre, did you have something you wanted to say before as we transition?
No, just thank you so much, Dr. Brock. You've set up so many interesting questions that we are looking forward to following up with in our more intimate conversation. And for those of you who were intrigued, please do think about becoming an AFOG member so that you too can join us in those smaller spaces. And Neelafar, any last words?
No, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Dr. Brock. This was a really interesting talk, and it ties really nicely into some of the things that we've been working on thinking about restorative and transformative justice approaches to things like moderation or governance in these platforms. So really looking forward to the conversation later. Thank you so much.